Behind this gate is a tunnel driven over 1 kilometre into solid rock. A massive gamble chasing gold that may not exist. Well, did the gamble pay off? Subscribe and find out.
Of all the quartz reefs on the Wandiligong goldfield, none of them were worked to a depth much more than 200 feet in the early days, because the gold at this level petered out. It was no longer economical to mine. However, during the golden era of Victoria, many other reefs, such as in central Victoria and at Bendigo and so on, quartz reefs were worked profitably to the remarkable depth of sometimes up to 4,000 feet below the surface. Miners in the Wandiligong and the Upper Ovens district believe too that perhaps there is a chance that the gold-bearing reefs in this area would be profitable at a much greater depth. During the late 1870s and early 1880s, most of these quartz reefs in the valley had almost been profitably worked out, and there are miners, a lot of miners who are now unemployed. It was at this dire economic time that the miners started to give this idea of deeper quartz reefs a really serious thought. In 1886, the Bright District Prospecting and Gold Mining Company was formed. This was a local backed company, and it was the intention of this company to test the reefs of the Wandiligong Valley at a greater depth than they had ever been tested before. It was the plan of this company to drive a massive tunnel or level adit 3,500 feet to intersect the Great Oriental Reef at a vertical depth of over 1,400 feet below the surface. This would be a massive undertaking that would take many decades to fulfil. This tunnel would become known as the Long Tunnel, a tunnel of hope and great optimism as this tunnel extended into the unknown depths of the Wandiligong goldfield. This is where the team of miners first started in late 1886, early 1887. This was the zero datum, the starting point that would lead them on a dark journey for many decades into the depths of the unknown. Fortunately, this water level's not going to maintain its depth, but until it shallows down a bit, we're going to be very anxious to get up a bit further to dry ground. By December 1888, 2 years since they commenced this long tunnel, they'd come this far, 900 feet. After 2 years of driving, they still had over 2,500 feet to go, and the cost of driving this tunnel at this time was £2 a foot. December 1889, 3 years later, they'd come this far, 1,500 feet, and it's still a long slog yet. 1896, 10 years on, they'd driven a massive distance of 2,669 feet. The ground at this point is very, very hard, and it was very slow progress. They're actually driving less than 1 foot a day, and that 1 foot was costing them £3 to drive at that time. By September 1900, they'd come 3,200 feet. We're almost at the very back, and the air's starting to get thin. We might not be able to get any further. There's still to be many years before they would strike any of the oriental workings, and there's some distance, about 300 feet or more further up the tunnel. A long way to go still, and it's a long way out. We might have to pull out ourselves, but we'll keep going for a little bit. We're over a kilometre into the tunnel now, and we're probably about half a kilometre below the ridge of the hill. The air's getting really thin in here, and back in the old days, this would have been a real problem for the miners, because you've got to pump fresh air in here all the time, because you're burning off a lot of oxygen. Just below us here is a galvanised pipe that was part of that system that originally pumped air into these workings over 100 years ago. We're going to have to call it quits now. There's barely enough oxygen in this tunnel to keep this candle alight. It's probably going to go out any second now. But before we go out, just up several hundred feet further up this long tunnel, there we go, they actually hit the oriental lines of reef, and they prospected along these with drives along the reef, and they actually found good-sized reefs. But unfortunately, they didn't contain gold, and it was over 20 years later that they made these discoveries. So after waiting for decades, there was nothing, no gold. Parties came back years later, right up until the 1930s, and still tried to find gold at this great depth. But unfortunately for the Wandiligong goldfields, no gold could be found at this astronomical depth below the surface. This massive mullock dump and that hole in the ground back there is more than just a monument to an extraordinary undertaking. Although it was unsuccessful, it is a tribute to our early pioneers and their optimism and determination at trying to find gold at a much deeper level than ever before. On the lower section of Driil's Creek, and there are a number of profitable quartz mines worked here in the early years. Some of those included the Elgin, the John Bull, the Lord of the Hills and so on. One of the earlier ones, which we're going out to have a look at now, was called Gander's Reef. Now we're heading a short distance out to Gander's Reef. Now, it's not so much the early history of this reef that we're interested in. We're interested in something that happened many years after this reef had been abandoned. Now, in 1886, the same year as the long tunnel was started, another venture was undertaken by a local company, and this company was called the Driil Company. They had a similar idea. They wanted to test the value of the reefs at a much deeper level. So they arranged for a diamond drill to be brought into the valley to bore down on some of the local reefs. And the local reef that they decided to test was Gander's old reef, because it was initially rich, a lot like the old Oriental. But Gander's reef was a little bit different to other reefs in the area in the fact that it was actually worked below the Growlers Creek level. Now, Gander's reef in the old days had previously been worked to a depth of 80 feet below the creek level. That was pretty extraordinary because they required lots of pumps and stuff to keep the workings dewatered. Now, when the Diamond Drill Company came along, they set up their drill here and they drilled down to a depth of 312 feet below the creek. And what was exciting is one of the core samples turned up gold at a depth of 195 feet below the creek. Now, with gold apparently rediscovered on Gander's reef, the Diamond Drill Company set up heaps of infrastructure about this site. They erected a massive poppet head and started sinking a shaft all the way down. 2 years later, they reached the depth of 195 feet, prospected around and couldn't find any gold. There was a public outcry because locals had invested so much money into this venture, and an inquiry was held, and the whole incident was called the Diamond Drill case. Well, after ages in court and so on, no charges could be laid on anyone because no one was found responsible, and the suspect gold-bearing core sample couldn't be found. So all of a sudden, this whole site was just closed down. Now, after the Diamond Drill Company had closed, the locals were pretty upset that Gander's reef hadn't really been tested. So a new company was formed several years later in 1894. This is actually a Ballarat company with heaps of capital, and they changed the name of this mine once again, and they called it the Lone Hand Extended Mine. Now, they erected another, even bigger head frame over this shaft in front of me here, and installed a new boiler, a winding engine, pumps, and they also erected a 5-head battery to do trial testing lots on the Gander's reef at very deep levels. They actually sunk this shaft over a 5-year period to a depth of 287 feet. However, during this time, they could not find any payable gold whatsoever. And so all we're left with today is this deep, dark and water-filled shaft.